My name is Theresa Wrangham, and I'm your moderator tonight for the U.S. Autism presentation. It's an ongoing series on approaches to autism. And tonight is a special night. We're covering rapid prompt method. And one of our key guests is Sameer Dahar. I wanted to share just a little personal piece before I turn over to another member of our panel to introduce the panel. I first met Sameer a few years ago during a conference, and our director, Marlo Payne-Thurman, brought him to our attention. And I have to say, he just rocked everybody's world that day and really set aside so many myths around the differences in communication. So I really hope you're going to enjoy tonight's presentation. And we're also going to have Dr. Thurman continue on board with us with tonight's presentation. She took the reins from our founder, Dr. Larry Kaplan, and we're so pleased to have her as a part of our panel tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn over to another advisory board member, Rob Bernstein.
Thank you, Theresa. And just to piggyback on what you were saying about Dr. Marlo Payne-Thurman, it's a pleasure to introduce you because you're usually in the background, but you're giving us the pleasure of not only you calling you the director, but Marlo is the president and the board chair of U.S. Autism Association. And we should also mention your consulting firm, right? It was a 2E Consulting Services, which pretty cool. So she's out there and she has all this, the experience that you need in this field. I want to really introduce Erika, because Erika Anderson is the experienced expert on rapid prompting method, the RPM. And she worked with verbal and nonverbal kids ranging from 4 to 40. So I like that. And she had at least 3 years experience under Soma, and she holds the highest level under what she called the Soma RPM certification. So, so welcome, Erika Anderson. And with that, we have one of her students. This is such a treat.
Yeah.
Sameer Dahar, one of her students. Sameer's here with Erika, and they're going to share with you what the RPM method is all about. And then we have Dr. Stephen Shore, who is an autistic professor at Adelphi University. And he wrote, I just happen to have I happen to have it here all the time. He wrote these books, Autism for Dummies. So that's pretty cool. And then this book, I really love this book. It's about his life. And also I think he probably spoke to more than 60 countries. He's gone all over the world more than once. So I'm going to introduce myself before Theresa, because then I'm going to hand it over to Theresa. But I just want to say that I see Theresa is a parent of an autistic girl, a woman now. And I also have a child and a brother. I don't know if you guys know this. I have a child and a brother on the autism spectrum. And I write about both of them in my book, even though my brother didn't like a lot of things I wrote. So, but the forward is by Temple Grandin, but the afterword is by my son, who's on the spectrum. I'm coming like Marlo is, and Stephen is, I'm coming with my experience of seeing, thousands of people on the spectrum over 35, 40 years. And before I hand it over to Theresa, I just want to introduce Theresa as well, that she has a daughter, Rachel, who's been diagnosed on the spectrum. So she's bringing her experience as a parent's perspective on raising kids who have ASD. So besides writing articles for many different magazines, Theresa is an experienced moderator, and we're so happy to have her. So Theresa, go ahead.
Thanks. So happy to be here tonight with such a wonderful panel. I think we're going to start off, Marla, weren't we going to start with Samir's presentation?
Yes, and I'm gonna
Normally, and I think I told the members of the panel tonight that we were going to be in speaker view, but I didn't realize that Sameer would be muted. So I'm going to go ahead and put us into gallery view so that our audience can meet and have some interaction with Sameer, because he won't be specifically speaking with his voice, although he has a lot of things he wants to share with us. So I am going to next share with you Samir's presentation. And I actually want to take just a minute and tell you a little background. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Sameer when he was, it's been a lot of years now. And I met Sameer as a young man, and he and I worked together for a period of time. I was actually his English teacher, helping him with a high school English class. I've worked with him in terms of helping bring him to US Autism. And I'm really, really pleased. And when I brought the organization together, I really felt it was very important that we had a non-vocal advocate on our board, because there's so many of our kids that really can't find their words and articulate. And I think Sameer would share with us that, you know, his voice is an important voice, because so many of our kids can't ever find that voice. So we're going to start the presentation tonight with a PowerPoint that Sameer has presented. And we had a little technical difficulty. He had recorded voice in it through his communication device in a technical reader's voice. But what happened is that's not broadcasting. So I'm going to become that voice and read that presentation for us tonight. So here we go on that share. Okay, so this is Sameer, and our topic tonight is how I learned to communicate, my journey through the Sensory world and the rapid prompting method. And on this slide, Sameer would like to share with you by saying, hello everyone on internet land. So happy to be here and to be a part of this community of learners in the rapid prompting method. Having met Soma and Erika many years ago, I feel privileged to have learned from them and to have progressed to the point of being able to communicate with you today. I feel privileged to be able to share my story with you. In my childhood, I lived in a world of fragmented reality. My asynchronous auditory faculties had me cowering in fear, as the high frequency sounds that I heard often gave me physical pain. I never heard my parents' conversations with me, and I had no desire to listen to them. Therefore, to drown out the discomfort, I focused on the visuals of colors and light in my surroundings. I studied the movements of the ceiling fan and the wall clock and how they change. And I found the minute hand of the wall clock was predictable and safe. I became fascinated with patterns, and I developed my own sensory language that no one else could understand. Though I was non-vocal, I communicated my sensory status as I flapped to filter auditory and visual stimuli. I twirled and I rocked my body to feel my geophysical presence. I analyzed and read sensory language of my body by recognizing its frequencies and patterns. I worked on organizing and categorizing each stimulus in my mind. Each day, I focused on management of my senses and tried to open a dialogue with my mind and rebellious body. I did so in silence. This was my reality then, and it is my reality today. Certainly, I could think and observe as a child before formal teaching. However, it was not until I practiced in mental selection or choice making through RPM sessions that I learned to use my memory effectively. Before communication, I lived in a reactionary existence to a superposition of stimuli. Information from my environment flowed like a river all at once, overwhelming me, and there was no direction, point of reference, or passage of time. It was impossible to focus. I was drowning in this river. I simply existed. My universe was born as I learned through RPM. I learned to use my senses to focus and to bring meaning to my existence. Quanta, or packets of information, became encoded in my mind in a sensory interface system of pattern recognition. Concepts like hot and cold, black and white were taught to become distinct words with associated sensory phenomena. These associations and connections built a network of ideas and information, which in turn created neural connections, which then grew in my mind. I learned to comprehend the environmental noise as I was introduced to phonics, grammar, creative writing, and math. It is still difficult trying to hear spoken language, but I have better practice discerning my auditory environment now. I am educated and I can read, comprehend, and process information in my own way. And by the way, I might add that not only is he educated, but graduated from high school and going to college. So I'll add that little bit in there. I believe language is more than words. It's a gateway to the human experience. We have to realize in autism, our movements and sounds are a language of their own. Universal modalities of nonverbal language exist in the natural world, like the honeybee dance, the quorum sensing of bacteria in bioluminescence, and the pheromone identification in animals. Why is it so hard to believe that we as human beings can also use sensory language? Why is it deemed a behavior with no meaning or purpose? Our neurodiversity has potential in defining our future. Our complex birthright has given us unique abilities, but we need accommodation, affirmation, and understanding. Our sensory language must be recognized and our communication supported. We must be educated in accordance with our potential and with our neurology. And Sameer would like to close by saying we must not be institutionalized or put in group homes simply because we are deemed to be labeled low functioning or nonverbal. We must be given basic human right of determination and communication. There is a lot of work to be done. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Sameer. That was beautiful. You always make me cry.
Me too. I'm going to try not to choke up now. So I think that Sameer's presentation really brings up a lot of opportunity to explore the subject of what is communication. And Erika, I wanted to start with you. Perhaps you could describe for our viewers a little bit about Soma and the rapid prompting method, and from your standpoint, some of the impetus and what you've seen in your experience in the way of communication.
Sure. So I think actually the interesting thing about that point, right, or that kind of question or point that you're making is at its core, RPM actually isn't a method of communication, right? RPM really is a method that is designed to empower the student or person using it, to give them the best possible means or tool to help them engage and be successful and give them the best possible means of output at that given time, for them to be able to express their learning, understanding, reasoning, thoughts, some of those things Sameer talked about in his presentation, right? Whatever tools is necessary for them at that given time, whether it was choices in the beginning, whether it becomes a letterboard, whether it's eventually handwriting or speech or a device of some sort, and using those open learning channels, those open senses, and being able to adapt those lessons and those teachings, and lessons not always academic lessons, but those teaching moments with them to help them be able to engage properly and work around some of those sensory difficulties that he was talking about so that they can be successful, and therefore then respond in whatever way is most successful for them. And sometimes that, might be, communicating something that is open-ended type of communication. It might be answering academic type questions. That might be, doing a hobby. That might be doing a life skill, so many different things. And so what's so interesting about the rapid prompting method is it truly is a method and a theory of engaging the student and empowering them with those tools so that they can be successful in what they're doing. And I think, kind of as Sameer talked about, I think that's one of the things that helps the student to be able to gain that regulation within themselves over time and work through some of those difficulties that we do see due to the difficulty with their sensory system, and how the sensory system and the different development that happens in autism, how we're able to work around that or work through that or build upon those senses that sometimes are overworking or underworking depending on the student. So I think that's a big part of it. Yeah.
Thank you for that detailed conversation.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. It sounds like RPM is really a method that, I mean, one of the myths that when I had my first interaction with Sameer was really, he confirmed to me what I always thought inside, because I know that there was this really pervasive belief, and I hope it's no longer pervasive, but that our folks on the spectrum who aren't able to verbalize or somehow thought to be at a lesser intellectual capacity. And I'll tell you what, that's such a fallacy.
Yeah.
And it's I think for me, it was more about realizing that sensory piece that you were talking about, that autism sometimes prevents bodies from working well, and that extends to verbalizing, but it by no means equals somebody is not intelligent.
Yeah.
This promotes a way for successfully communicating in a way we neurotypicals can chime in on.
Yeah, you know, I think the sensory system, and Soma talks a lot more detailed and brain-based, in her books and things like that, and so people that want that route can go that route, right? But and she does really tie it to that. I agree, Sameer. Yes. It is that idea of assuming the competency of it, but how do we reach it, right? How do we get there? And I think it's interesting because when you look at a lot of, methods out there, whether it's RPM or other methods, what makes a really good teacher, or a person working with the students, it really is, I think over the years that I've worked with students, as people that are good at working with the students are the teachers that are good at engaging them. They're able to connect with those students and work through those learning channels that are open at that time or not open at that time. They're able to figure out, okay, this is connecting, this is not connecting, and have that belief in them, and not think that just because something's wrong or they're doing something, or or this is happening, that it wouldn't be that they just don't know it or they don't get it. Having more of that belief in that idea that, okay, something else is happening, how do I get around that so that they can intake this information or they can understand what they need to get from it. And I think that makes a big difference in then your ability to really intake what I need you to intake and learn from it. Yeah.
I wanted to make a housekeeping announcement very quickly before we continue. I'm sorry I didn't make it earlier, but we do have a Q&A ability within the session and all our sessions in the series. So if our viewers have questions, please type them in the Q&A, and Marlo and I will do our best to get those answers for you. Rob, you had, I saw that you wanted to interject something. Please go ahead.
Well, it's too late. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, okay, I'm going to move on to Stephen.
Right. Oh, you're good. No, I think what Erika said was really important. And you're trying to, how you can get around something that is whatever, not working. And the first thought that came to my mind is how the student, how Sameer in this case, can get around it. That's the ultimate, is how they can get around so they can navigate themselves into a productive or a successful, whatever he's doing, communication or interaction. So I guess you do that as well because we have Sameer, but I just wanted to throw that out. It's not just how we are as teachers. We're responsible to how do we figure this out? Ultimately, we want the students to do it themselves.
I wanted to just jump in for a quick second. Apparently the chat isn't showing up for all the attendees. So if you're wanting to get through to us, be sure and use the Q&A. Sameer has actually added a couple things to the chat that I want people to hear because they're not seeing them on their end. The one main thing is that he's saying that this teaching is very revolutionary as it assumes competence through its sensory motor pathways. And I think that's a really important message to get out to our audience tonight.
Yeah. Yeah, and that definitely kind of, Rob, adding on to what you said, is definitely our goal for our students to gain the abilities for them to do those themselves, over time. And that's what we want to build. I think it's important, though, for people to realize that a lot of times people think that from day one, I think, it's a student's responsibility. And that's the part I think that's important to know, that it's not a student's responsibility from day one. That's part of your job as the teacher too. If something's not working, it's not just on the student. And I think that's the change of this idea of everything being so, that's a big part of rapid prompting method, is not looking at everything as a negative behavior, right? Sameer, you addressed that, Sameer, right? About how, stims are really a way for students to either regulate themselves or as kind of that body's regulatory tool or defensiveness to certain things that are going on. And I think it's one of those situations where, sometimes for certain people, it's this idea of, we have to, we expect the student to just kind of convert and accept. And I do think that's changing. It's been changing over some years now of a different mindset. But I do think, as teachers, we have to remember that they're not always able to do that, right? And that's our goal over time, that they'll be able to do that. But if they're not able to, that's then our job. How can we help to change things or to make those changes so that they are successful in engaging right now until they're able to do that successfully on their own?
And just to bring that one point, if I can, Theresa, when you say students' responsibility, what it's part of that is like blaming the victim. It's his responsibility. It's the parents. How many times have I heard that? It's the parents' responsibility. Wait. It's the parent. The parent has enough issues. Why are people blaming? So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. So the audience could look at it. Oh yeah, no, the parent shouldn't be blamed. The kid shouldn't be blamed. Let's figure it out, and let's just figure it out.
Yeah.
I wanted to read, Sameer was adding in that stimming is okay. It directs senses. And, that's a really good point. Stephen, I want to turn to you for a moment because you and I have had several discussions about stimming and how, unfortunately, much like Rob and Erika were talking about, that we're fighting a paradigm of maybe looking at behaviors and what we don't understand as a negative and putting the burden and responsibility on the victim, the person who is struggling, when in fact we should be watching and making room for their expression. And I'm wondering if you could add to the conversation from your perspective.
Yeah, I certainly can. And I think one thing we need to do is we need to think about what these behaviors or actions do. They're commonly referred to as repetitive non-functional behaviors. And as I look about a classroom when I'm teaching students, or if I'm speaking at a conference, I see many in the audience, maybe even most, engaging in repetitive non-functional behavior, if that's what we're going to call it. There's people bouncing their legs, there's people doodling, twirling their hair, biting the end of their pen, all kinds of things. And if you call somebody out on it, after they're done being embarrassed and you ask them why they're doing that, eventually they'll get around to, well, it helps me concentrate. And really what they're getting at is, and a better way to look at it, is to think of these actions as self-regulatory behaviors. Because we're always up-regulating or down-regulating. Up-regulating to keep from falling asleep. That's why some people stand at the back of the room in class or during a conference, or down-regulating because they may be a little bit more anxious than they wish they had been. And regular motions help calm them down. And it allows them to concentrate on whatever needs to be concentrated on or focused on. And so for the student, for example, who's doodling during my class, well, first I'll call attention to it and the student will say, oh, no, sorry, I won't do it. I said, no, keep doodling. It helps you concentrate and focus. And that's how we need to be thinking about these self-regulatory behaviors. Additionally, maybe they're telling us something. If a student is engaging in self-regulatory behavior that perhaps is not usual for them, maybe there's something going on internally to them, or there's something in the environment that's up to us. I'm not going to blame the student, but it's up to us to figure out what is causing this sensory overload. Finally, as we think about these self-regulatory behaviors, there are some behaviors that perhaps can be distracting in a given situation. So suppose we have a student who's flapping their hands, nothing wrong with flapping in class. When I watch The Price is Right, I see many people flapping when they get called down to the front. But suppose that or another action is disturbing and disruptive in a situation. So now it is up to us to find another behavior that perhaps is less disruptive, but still satisfies the need, because the need is going to be met whether you like it or not. Saying quiet hands, hands down, things like that, perhaps it may work for a few seconds, but the probability is extremely high that something else is going to replace it that will likely be more difficult to address in the first place. So what I might do in a classroom, if I have a student who's, say they're flapping, they're sitting in the front of the room, no, I'm not going to move them to the back of the room, which some people will do. Okay, nobody will see them flapping, let them flap and take off, and nobody can see them in the back. That's kind of punishing the student. I might walk over to that student while I'm doing whatever I'm doing and say, here, squeeze this. Now, the this being a therapy ball. And maybe that will satisfy the need. Maybe I'll be proactive and put the two sides of sticky Velcro tape underneath a desk, so the students can run their fingers across it, either the soft side or the rough side, up to them as they need it. And really what this is working with autistic characteristics, which are really just human characteristics, not against them, but working with them. They are there for a reason. They're satisfying a need, and it may be up to us to figure out what that need is.
Stephen, I think that brings up a really important point that has been emphasized throughout the course of this series, no matter what approach we're talking about, and that is trying to meet the individual where they're at. And
right.
Erika, I wanted to ask you, because I would think that perhaps there must be some challenge, and or maybe there's not. This isn't, it's not my area. It wasn't my experience with my daughter. But I assume that at some level, RPM has to meet the individual where they're at. I think it must be very isolating for someone who maybe isn't able to verbalize to try to figure out how is the world working? How do I make myself heard? How do you start helping them with RPM? How do you reach them?
So some processes of RPM are, common of getting started, right? So we, it's very much starts with factual based information to get started. So it's not overwhelming by talking about, how do you feel and, open-ended type things that are going to put them on edge and things like that. So those things are very common to get started. But actually, some of it is kind of even what Stephen was saying. What we're looking at is we are actually, one of the big parts of RPM is using those stems to really identify those learning channels and how we're going to engage a student when we first sit down. I have a small intake I use just to kind of know age, maybe what they've done in the past, like, are they going to school? Are they not going to school? Especially, I obviously have to update my my bio because my oldest student now is in his 70s and not 40s. So obviously I have to update that. But, so students that I do have that are in group homes, what are they doing? I do ask some of those basic questions, but I don't have like an 80-page intake or anything like that. And my students, when they first come to me, they walk in the door, I take them in the room and we go. And so I really am in those first sessions, am using those stems and what I see on them as my tool to indicate what's going on. And so that is what we're using. We're using those as a tool to understand them. And that is one of the key components of RPM is to look at those stems. The calming stems, we break it down into two facets. We have calming stems, and those ones we 100% allow, and they can happen. And again, we use them as kind of our eyes into what is going to work to help them learn. So if a student is, got a pencil and they're kind of doing something like this in front of them, maybe they have something kinesthetic might help them to learn and engage, and something like that. So maybe I would use that when I'm teaching them. Or if a student is sitting there doing this on their arms, that's tactile and that's calming, maybe something like that would help them to engage when I'm teaching them. So I'm looking at all those types of things. Even some of the ones that are more excitatory, and that's our kind of other category, and we want to compete against those. As much as I want to compete with those stems, I'm still looking at those to see and using those to help me identify what's going on with a student. And so especially in those first couple of sessions, again, a lot of what I'm identifying for a student and getting to know the student are based around those learning channels and those stems and things like that. And a lot of then what I'm doing to help them gain those abilities to learn to show and demonstrate are through just teaching, okay, where are your motor skills at? If you don't have them, okay, we'll teach them, and just getting to know them in those first couple of sessions and things like that.
I think we had another comment, and Marlo, I'm sure you have something to add as well from your perspective of your work.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Sameer, I hope, is it okay with you if I share the chapter of your book about stems a little bit in terms of just some communications? I'm assuming that's okay with you. Can't tell if I've got it okay on that. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So Sameer has shared with me, and when he's written this book, and it's still in the process of being published, but it's this idea that there's many different kinds of stems and that they serve very functional purposes. And I was in reading this, I was really blown away by some of them, because it's things, I mean, I've been working autism my whole life and I've never heard these things before, but they make so much sense. And he was talking about that when I stem and bounce my voice off of my hand, I can echolocate where I'm at. So that was one. He talked about that when I'm with other autistic people, I can use my stems to communicate with them And we use STEM in a way of joint communication that other people really don't understand. So there was just a lot of things, and things have to do with light, things that have to do with sound, things that have to do with where my body is in space, things that have to do. So it wasn't just the simplest upregulation or downregulation. It was literally using the physical body in ways that interacts with the environment in ways that we might do differently. But that, and I think he talked about this in the, in his presentation a little bit earlier, talks about why, if we can luminesce, if animals can luminesce, then why can't I use my stems as a sensory way of communicating and interacting with my world? So it's more than just something that I do. And by the way, certainly, Stephen, you're correct in that there is an up-regulation and a down-regulation, but that it's a lot more complicated. STEM behavior is a lot more complicated than I had thought originally, or that I understood. And I've learned a lot about that from Sameer. So Sameer, thank you for that insight to both our audience and to me through the years in terms of what STEMs really can include and encompass for you.
Also, Sameer also made a comment earlier as we were talking about meeting the individual where they're at within an RPM environment. And, he added in that RPM used my strengths by redirecting my STEM. I was integrated over time. And, really that's what you were talking about, Erika, is you were using the stems as a clue as to, let's take that and run with it and see if we can get a back and forth going, right?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and Sameer, I don't know, Sameer, if you have comments on this or if he's talked about this, but one of the things that's also interesting and unique is, we definitely, use and accept, the calming stems and things like that. But what is interesting, what Soma talks a lot about is she also subgroups those excitatory stems. And the excitatory stems, and Marlo, this goes to kind of what you were talking about there and looking at it in all these different groupings and categories is, so Soma talks though about how some of these excitatory stems, though, if not cautioned, so part of it is, if you're not careful though, because Sameer was talking about it earlier about how in the beginning, so much of it was spent with that visual, that if you think about it, had you not found RPM, right? Or something else that would have helped you with that, okay? You could go with that too. And it didn't help you to pull your mind out of just that visual. It becomes so obsessive then, right? And that's the only area, and everything else kind of gets neglected a little bit. And that's what Soma kind of has seen over the years, and part of what she's looked at, and when she's connected everything to the brain research that she's looked at, is how, the excitatory stems, you do have to be very careful with though, because it's not like you want to be mean and you can't do that. It's not that, but it's this fine balance you play, because something that is calming is good, but something that is too much, and this can be for neurotypical people too, right? Something that is too much then can become something that becomes obsessive, and something that's obsessive can become too addicting. And so that's why it's so imperative that we do foster the idea of the other things, and that we keep it at a regulatory state. And I think that's why it's so imperative for our students that we find those ways to be able to engage them in healthy ways of using their minds and their hands and bodies in ways that it keeps it at that regulatory state. And then for those other senses that maybe are not as strong, we don't forget about them, but we are able to foster them in a good way too, but in a way that works for them, so that it feels okay for them too. So, yeah.
And Sameer also added, as Marlo was talking about his use of sound for like echolocation, and that it wasn't simply about upregulation or downregulation. Sameer typed, I feel my auditory is magnified, high frequencies. And, you know, that really kind of makes sense when you think about that whole echolocation piece that you were just sharing with us that Sameer had wrote, Marlo. I'm wondering if, you know, you stole, Erika, you stole my segue.
Oh, sorry.
You made it really clear that RPM is used across the ages. You have someone who was 70 that you worked with. How young of a child have you worked with?
2 or 3.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course, then at 2 or 3, you're doing choices and you know, sometimes find letters and things like, you know, anything you would be doing with a 2 or 3-year-old in like a little preschool and things like that. Very age appropriate, you know, not spelling out these huge words or anything like that, but very age appropriate. Yeah, and a big basis of where, you know, RPM has developed a lot. So I'm actually quite old school RPM. I've been around for many years now with Soma doing RPM, and so I know early years RPM, and it really has developed and it has changed in many ways. And one of the things that she has developed over more recent years is really trying to you know, help families additionally use the theory and the method for other things other than just sitting and doing an academic lesson. And so I think that would be the additional part for especially the young students too, you know, older students as well, but definitely at that younger age, if you're starting younger, definitely making sure you're looking at the hobby development and using it with that and the life skills and whatnot. The more you can use those hands and you can get them engaged in purposeful motor activities, the less likely you are then to have some of the other situations happen with that.
Sameer also shared as you were speaking, Erika, that I do need a method to filter. And overexcitation, I lose my ontological identity.
Sameer talked about, I think we talked about the sound sensitivity. If we remember early on, Sameer talked about part of the reason that he was tuned out and didn't maybe develop languages because sound was painful. And I see that hugely across the board. It's certainly not 100%, but it's high frequency sound. And it's almost like I've been told by so many of my clients, it's either I can tune it out completely, or if I'm tuned into it, it shuts me down, but I can't function within high frequency sound. And it's interesting because I think when I've started testing that in my practice, I do assessments, and we've started testing for sound discrimination, listening, and noise. And I have yet, and that doesn't mean there's not someone out there, but I have yet to test an individual on the autism spectrum that doesn't struggle with some aspect of listening and noise. And it's not because these kids or young adults or adults aren't hearing, it's that they hear so well that they're not filtering and hearing speech sounds, human speech sounds, in the same way as other people. And I'd be interested, Stephen, in particular, your thoughts on that, because I know you don't have as much of that sound sensitivity issue.
Yeah, well, I've got some, and you're right. It's a question of hearing too much, maybe even more accurately, hearing unevenly.
Okay.
So think of it as an equalizer. And there are some sounds, such as those of us who have high-pitched sensitivities. That part may be turned up too high and it's too sensitive. One type of sound I do crave are low-pitched sounds. And pre-pandemic, I would often go to a movie if I felt that there'd be some nice low subsonic sounds as part of the movie. But that's the way my frequency equalizer is set up. Whereas there are others who are truly bothered by low pitch sounds. So it depends on the person. And often, while the ears are working perfectly fine, something happens on the way to or in the brain, and sounds could be scrambled as a sort of central auditory processing disorder. And that's one thing that can make verbal interaction, spoken interaction, challenging.
I wonder, Rob, you're a parent as I am. And I really want to key in on something that Sameer had said. He's saying it's a high sensitivity, but he was talking a little bit earlier about really needing a filter. And I know that when my own daughter got to middle school, you know, she was no longer in a contained classroom all day. She was having to pass through hallways with hundreds of other children to get to her next class. And it brought on a new behavior. She started talking to herself as in her passing period. And the reasoning is she didn't have a filter to stop trying to process every conversation she was hearing as she went down the hall. And talking to herself or singing or whatever she did, it was like a jamming signal so that her brain wouldn't try to process everything she was hearing because it's all up at the same volume. Rob, I was just wondering, as a parent, have you seen a different level of some of this with regard to filtering and that sort of thing?
I wish I knew now when I knew when my kid was 2 years old. You know, there'd be circle time in the summer program, and I always had access to this program, and everyone's in the circle. But my kid was like a coyote. He was circling the circle. He had to take himself out of that circle because it was, like you were saying, it's too stimulating. It's so common that kids will take themselves out, at least in my experience, of a let's say a noise situation. I have a girl now who hasn't been in school since it's opened, and when, you know, with the COVID issues, and she just avoids the situation and entirely. And I think it's the noise has a lot to do with it. So she just refuses to go to school. And she's 14 and she's very, very bright. And she's a poet. And the day before she was going to go to school for the first time all year, she wrote a poetry poem. And, she, you know, I think I could even read it to you. It's really interesting. The title of the poem is Trapped. She's trapped. You know, whether she goes and, you know, she just feels trapped and all this anxiety. She wants to go to school. Her friends are there, but she cannot in a real physical way, in a visceral way, go there. So she takes herself out of the situation. And I even talked to Steve about this. What I told her, I said, I want to understand the noise, the anxiety. Go there and with your poetic, creative, open mind, take in what is causing this anxiety. Is it the lights? Is it the guard by the door? Is it the noise? I know it's the noise because that's on her list, but I want her to tell me or tell herself in real time, what is the anxiety? What is the noise? So maybe we could go in another entrance. If that's what it is, let's go in the gym entrance. Gym always has a door open, right? Let's go in another entrance. Let's figure something out to make it a situation where you could function well.
Great points. Marlo.
Yeah, one of the things that I've learned in my practice is that some of these kids really benefit from in-ear filters that block out certain frequencies of sound. There's a couple of different brand names of those, musicians' ear being one, and then there's some custom ones. But for some kids, that really calms down the competing voice and gives them that ability to hear kind of the human voice in that center bandwidth without all of that background noise. So that I'd like to mention that because that's something that a lot of my clients have really benefited from.
Just from your presentation, Sameer, and this is for Erika, and this might be maybe I'm not understanding it correctly, but I thought that you were saying you're overwhelmed by sensory stuff, but then there's a link to language. There's a system, whether it's filled, there's something happens. I want you to talk about that moment when it comes from overwhelming and unproductive to like language. I want to, if there is a transition point, I'd love to hear more about that.
And I can actually add something from the book about that, Rob, because one of the things that really happened, Sameer was in a progression where I was involved with, where he when he started, he only had a handful of words, and then he had 100, 150 words. And then he was really getting very, by the way, the whole time he was reading, he could type, he could communicate through RPM, but he was getting some vocal words. And as that was happening, there was a process where he was really feeling like he was losing some of his visual and perceptual abilities for a time, because it's like as he was switching over to language, he felt like he was losing some of his, ability to use his other senses. And I thought that was a really interesting, and I don't know if that would be true for other people or not, but Sameer kind of mentioned that to me. And that really maybe gives us some clues about how powerful the language system is in terms of directing the other sensory organizational systems in the brain. And what was really happening for him is there was kind of a rewiring that he wasn't terribly sure he was happy about.
It's
He didn't know if he wanted to lose some of those things.
That's good. Thank you.
Well, and Sameer, thank you. You finished the thought Sameer was sharing with us is RPM method prompting gave me a working model of geophysical identity by rational thinking to combat having a meltdown. So it sounds to me like, in some sense, this provided even like that regulatory piece we were talking about, where it must be extremely frustrating to be in a body that doesn't work well, wanting to communicate and not having that ability. And RPM gave that and helped down regulate perhaps some of the anxiety associated with that. Erika?
Sameer, maybe you could clarify and just double check that I'm thinking correctly. Sameer had a lot of the visual dominancy of the sense system, right, when he was younger. But really, actually, the auditory channel, although he does have some of the high frequency situations, the visual dominancy that he had, that actually goes back to that altered sensory system I was talking about. That visual dominancy wasn't actually like his good learning channel. That was just the one that was overpowering and taking control. So really, part of what happened with RPM is we were able to come in and help him gain better access to his auditory channel. And when that happened, then he was able to compete against some of that visual dominancy that was happening. A lot of times I think there's this idea that because the visual was so strong that it's going to be strong as good, but it really wasn't strong as good. It was strong as overpowering. And so therefore you struggle with those other senses that you really do need for things in the world.
Okay, so we're getting a little message from Sameer. I see words both as information and sensory, and it sounds like he's going to take a small break. Is that right, Sameer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that, and Marlo, do you know from reading his book, is that what you got as well?
Well,
from it?
And it was almost like, and I would say it was more than visual. It was the whole arena of sensory experiencing through his body.
Yeah.
And that was actually so dominant that there was no energy left over for communication.
Yeah.
And so we had to down regulate some of that to get a channel or pathway or I kind of call it energy. It's almost like to have enough energy to apply that to communicating or to the system of communication or the part of the brain that needs the energy for communication. This is a period of time where he was reading on a college level, but practicing reading out loud like kindergarten books, right? For the purpose of actually practicing in his mouth, and that he was observing inside of himself that, wait a minute, I don't know if I want this language system, because I really have grown to accept, love, and appreciate the fact that I see three-dimensional space easily, and that I can look at things from all these different angles, and I can experience, and he uses the word geophysical a lot, but what he's really saying is that my body in my entire space and my entire sensory system functions very differently. And as I was moving into language, I felt like some of that was kind of going away, and I was losing some skills that I really liked and enjoyed and giving them away to this system of language. Although I was willing to do that because I wanted to be able to communicate and interact in the world, but that by doing that, I was kind of sad to maybe be letting some of that stuff go. And I don't know if those things ever came back or not, because I never heard the backside of that over time. But I remember reading that and thinking how profound that was. It makes sense. We're the only, mammal that communicates with this much complexity, but it makes sense that that takes a tremendous amount of our cognitive energy, possibly away from other systems, so that if we don't have language, we have all this cognitive energy left over for geophysical, spatial, right?
Yeah.
Luminescing, echolocating. I mean, all of those energies can get applied to other things. And so what he's really saying here is that by communicating, by using RPM to develop a method of communication, I found a geophysical identity. In other words, I found my place on this planet. I found a physical space where a space that I contained, versus having this continuums between me and space that aren't really clear. And I think that's a lot deeper than what he's able to write in these words. And I've read some of these things, so I can maybe, and I'm not sure I'm getting it 100% right, but that's my understanding of what he was trying to communicate.
And the self-awareness that shows is just remarkable.
And the intelligence that shows.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that really does break down that myth around equating being able to verbalize in a maybe more recognized way is somehow equated to intelligence. Erika, I just realized we're an hour in, and I haven't really given our viewers an opportunity to maybe have you show an RPM tool or kind of explain it a little bit more. We're talking in abstracts, and for viewers who don't know what it is and how it works, I don't know if you can kind of hold something up and talk a little bit about that, and maybe some of the history, maybe challenges or pros and cons that the method has faced, because many approaches to autism have faced different challenges in acceptance.
Sure. So Soma Mukhopadhyay, there you go, who developed the method, she developed it completely, not by accident, but I don't have a better word. She developed it for her son, Tito, who has autism. Well, they were still living in India. And so she developed it. It was not a method at that time. She developed it for her son when he was diagnosed, and the doctors pretty much told her to keep him busy. And so she did. She went to the library, she checked out all the brain books she could find, and she started to research and figure out, okay, what would my brain be doing? What maybe is different based on what he's doing? And that's really kind of what she did. And then she kept him busy, and she started working with him, and she just did a whole bunch of different things. She taught him to handwrite. She taught him to point to letters. And it was really the initial stages of what became the rapid prompting method. But at that time, it was not that. So word got around, the BBC got involved. They did some documentary type things, and word got around. They were then brought to the United States some years later, because they did want to do some testing with some different doctors on Tito. They actually did some testing between Tito and Temple Grandin, kind of looking at the difference between someone who is more auditory versus someone who was more visual, things like that. And they were doing some dual testing that way. When they were over here doing some of that testing, some of the families that had brought her over here said, would you be interested in working with our kids? And just seeing what happens. And she said, okay, that sounds fine. Anyone that knows Soma knows that she can't sit still for any period of time. And so she did, and it worked. They did well, they responded to her. And that's really actually kind of how it was born. I think she says it's been a while now since she's said it. I think it was like a cameraman from the BBC or something that actually named it. He was like, well, you talk really fast. You give some prompting to keep them engaged. So you should call it the rapid prompting method. And that's how it was named. So she didn't even name it. But anyways, so that's kind of how that was born. She was in California at that point, and then from there, a nonprofit organization out of Austin, Texas, got in contact with her and asked her about coming on board with them and moving to Austin. And so she agreed, and she moved out to Austin with Tito, and that's where then they made more of a permanent residence. And then she became part of Halo, which is where she currently is and whatnot. So that was in 2004. In 2005, I actually heard about rapid prompting method. I was working as an ABA line therapist, and one of my students had a spot to see Soma here in Wisconsin at a workshop. And I thought, whatever, okay, I'll go, that's fine. And so I went, and I was actually, I had my teaching degree, and so, or I was getting my teaching degree, and the teacher in me fell in love with the method. And so that was 2005. And then in 2007, I was offered the apprenticeship from Soma. And so that's kind of how I began my journey. And so in 2007, I moved down to Austin, Texas, and lived in Austin for 3 years studying under Soma. And I studied there as her apprentice for 3 years, and then moved back up here and have had our clinic since then. As far as then RPM goes and how it's changed and adapted in some of the different things over the years. As I said in the beginning, it was a lot. I think at that time, the idea of having a method that really focused on academics was very novel, was very new. And so it was very much that in the beginning. It was very much around that, and the idea that students could do academics at maybe more of that higher level. And so I think the earlier years, it was a lot about that. And it's, like I said, it's evolved. It's very much still a factual teaching method. But I think as the years have progressed, obviously there is the communication aspect of it. But we do now, as the years have progressed, we definitely incorporate a lot more too on looking towards those other skills in life and using the method to help develop those other skills, whether it be life skills, hobby development. A big focus, for example, for my business is the adult age for students. Half of my clientele are students above the age of 20. I work with a lot of students in group homes and how we can serve the older populace, even if they're no longer with their families or out in the communities and things like that. So I think that's developed and changed. Some of the tools, and then you can, if there's anything question-wise I missed, you can ask me that too, sorry. Some of the tools that are classic type RPM tools, choices, although again, choices aren't necessarily something that only RPM uses, but choices. We use written choices, we use like verbal choices where students would respond though, usually on the letter board or a device or something like that. We have like the traditional plastic letter board, has the ABCs on them. We do also have a stencil board. So a stencil board has, again, all the 26 letters. But then one of the other things that we're kind of classically known for is whether it's for students building motorical skills or motor skill, or if it's actually for students that are great motor-wise, but struggle with like the extraction of words, extracting the right word at the right time. We do have then the stencils that break it down as well and things like that. So there is a progression where students build up on the different boards and things like that. So yeah, so these are some of the classic RPM tools that we use. But again, another thing that I think is not known to people and is definitely part of RPM, we do not just stay on the letter board. Our students learn to many students learn, we move to handwriting. We do use speech for those that it gets to that or have that, but purposeful speech, not just, repetitive or not just for wants and needs. We do work the speech, we do work devices. It is our goal for our students to become independent. And one of the big things for RPM compared to other methods is we are not a facilitated type method. So we do not physically support a student or anything like that.
Wasn't there some confusion about that at one point for RPM? And I imagine there was a challenge clearing that up. Is RPM in schools? Is that, are you guys past that?
I mean, there's still sometimes the question of that. I do think it was a little bit more earlier on. And it's come and gone in waves throughout the years, you know, but I think it was a little bit more earlier on. We definitely have schools that support it. Again, because of my school background, I actually I've consulted with a lot of schools over the years. So yeah, definitely schools that do take it on. They see the success of it with students, things like that. Again, focusing that it's a method of engagement and things like that, and you use the different tools. We are not facilitated. We do prompt for initiation. We do not prompt for an answer, you know, and that's a big part of what RPM is. We prompt for that initiation of body movement, so prompt to keep them going, but we do not prompt for an answer. And even that fades more and more as students gain those abilities.
Wonderful. We do have a question from the audience, and it is for Sameer, but he is still on break. And so I'm wondering maybe if Erika and Marlo would know if Sameer has an opinion about this. It says, question for Sameer regarding language. I've read Temple Grandin saying she thinks in pictures. Do you have any comments about that? I'm assuming it's a comment or a question around, is Sameer more of a picture-based person, or how, you know?
Yeah, I'll tell you what he said in his book. And this, I think we talked about it just a tiny bit before. It's more than visual. It's the integration of the entire sensory system outside of language. All of the senses kind of come together, but definitely from a learning style perspective, he's very visual, but but I do cognitive testing. And so one of the things I can tell you is that, you know, that they actually did put Sameer through a process where he actually did the verbal portion of an IQ test with a very, very high verbal IQ. So it's important to understand that there's the verbal mind versus the verbal voice, and that you can be verbally wired without a voice. Does that make sense in terms of learning style? And so Temple really talks about thinking in pictures. And I don't know if Sameer would say that that's completely true for him, because he always thought in words. He just had no way to get words out to us. And by the way, when I say thought in words, he processed language. He was, again, remember, he was reading and understanding what he was reading when he was 4 or 5 years old. So he had to have a language-based system that was processing in words and language long before he was able to put that through his mouth, right? So again, it's that difference between what's up here in terms of your learning style, but compared to how you demonstrate. And Temple would tell us that her learning style is very visual. And I'm not sure Sameer would say that's as true for him, because I think for him, he would say it's more sensory. And Erika, you may have a really different position on that, because I think his sensory system was very engaged by visuals. So that was what drew him in, is his visual system.
Yeah, you know, Sameer is interesting, because I feel Sameer did at times have the visual, but I do think, again, the visual for him was sometimes a dominating hindrance. And so it was very selective at times. And you know, he did have the auditory part that really came along and was a strong bit of his learner channel. So I'd be interested to see what he would say about that. It was interesting that Temple's brought up, because this is part of really what like Temple and Tito were looked at, right? So Tito is a very, very auditory based person, whereas Temple is not. And that's what we really do find in RPM. We have such a variety of students that you do have.
Stephen, I'm wondering if from your perspective as a self-advocate, you know, we've all heard on the panels that we've participated in about the thinking in pictures, but I know from working with many advocates, it is very individual. That Temple represents perhaps one learning style or one channel that was very important for her. Do you want to speak a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, I certainly do. And I think the autistic learning experience is like everybody else's. It's just a lot more so. I do know many autistic people who are so non-visual they can't read a map. But the difference is that whereas most people, whatever the learning style happens to be, we'll call it visual. Suppose it's visual, and maybe their weakest modality is auditory. Most non-spectrum people will still have enough in their auditory processing capability to get them through life. It gets them through school, it gets them through their daily lives, it gets them through work. It's good enough. But for the autistic person, that weak or challenging modality is just not available. And that brings to mind a friend of mine who, it took me 3 years to convince her that she could do a doctoral degree. So finally she did. She jumped in, applied, and she's now finishing her doctoral degree. She's gotten all A's in her courses except for statistics and quantitative research. She and numbers just don't get along. They don't get along to such a point that she's learned a long time ago not to have a checkbook. It doesn't work. Out of sight, out of mind. And the way that plays out for her when she does her research is, unlike most people who may have a pile of research articles on their desk, and you go shuffling through the pile to pull the one that you need at any particular time, or those who are more into using the computer, you get the same effect. You got a bunch of documents open on your computer and you shuffle through them until you find the one that you want. With her apartment, every horizontal surface on her apartment is overrun with research studies because she has to see them all. If she puts them in a filing cabinet, for example, or some of them in a filing cabinet, then they might as well just not exist. And that's how it works for her.
Well, we just had a comment from Sameer. I think he still might be on break a little bit, but I think he's listening because he commented, I'm an image organization expert. I have increase in language over time. Symbol determination was real manifold of language. I'm not sure I understand the last part, but what I hear him saying, and maybe Marlo and Erika, you can chime in, having known Sameer better, is images are an important piece of intake for Sameer, but it sounds like there's a lot more to it.
Well, and I think one of the things that he was able to share with me is that as he began RPM and he was seeing these words, right, and they matched up with these sounds that he'd heard, then he was like, wow, there's a system to this noise. This noise has a system, right? And then as he was able to see it and pair that then with the things that he had already read, he was like, wow, these sounds match these words that I've read in these books, right? And that was where things kind of fit together. And by the way, correct me if I'm wrong, Sameer, but I think it was seeing the symbols that went with the sounds, even though in his mind, he was already a reader.
This reminds me of something that I just started. You know, I've been doing this for 35, 40 years, and I'm doing something now for the first time. And what Sameer wrote, the last thing he wrote reminded me of that, and that it sounded like poetry. To me, that sounded like poetry. Symbol determination was a real manifold of language. I mean, you know, and I'm using poetry now in my therapy. And I actually have one of the books right here. My poet friend recommended it. Very simple books about poems about nature. And I just would wonder, I don't know if it's something, and we talked about this last time, that we have these methods. And last time we had somebody doing animal therapy. We haven't heard one other person using animals in their therapy. I don't know why or why not. It's an interesting question. Why not use poetry in some of these approaches that we're gathering? Why not? I'd be curious. And I don't know if
we use poetry.
Yeah, I would love to you to talk about that, and I'd be fascinated by it.
Poetry and math and stories, they are some of the most calming things in lessons to get a student into a reasoning part of your brain. They will bring you back to more of that reasoning, calm state. Fast, this is one of the things is, so we don't, when we start, I'm not going to start, like I said, with any of those, talking about feelings and things like that. A lot of times too, if I have a student that's dysregulated, a lot of times people want to say, what's wrong? What's this? Tell me this. Even a person, a neurotypical person, if you come in and say, oh, what's going on? What's wrong? It just feeds those emotions worse, right? And so a lot of times, Soma actually just did a webinar on this recently about what lessons you could do. And she went through a whole list of poems, William Blake's poem on sadness or something like that. I don't have the poem off the top of my head now, but William Blake has a poem on sadness and a poem on happiness and all this. And we literally use all these different poems as a way to talk about the emotions without so directly saying, hey, tell me how you're feeling. So yeah, no, we use those all the time. And it is so much of a better way to address it in a more non-direct way.
That's exciting that your approach, and you started to say this, that your approach, it doesn't have this systematic system. It's really a broad way of working with the person, where he's at, where he is in life, what he needs. And that's one thing I like about this approach.
I wanted to add that Sameer continues to add to his thoughts on this. I believe he's heard the question. Sameer, I'm going to repeat it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. There was a question about reading that Temple Grandin thinks in pictures. Do you have comments about that? Now I wanted to let you all know what he's said in the interim. Symbols are my transition to words and phonic patterns and RPM. Math is key to calming. Poetry had patterns. Poetry, sensory images. That's really, I just want to say as a mom who's been told several times what her child on the spectrum will never do. She's exceeded all those things almost without exception, but that's such a high level abstract thought. And that is something that as parents who love and care for our children and have these concerns and are trying to find the right approach to autism, I think was a struggle for our family. We just couldn't accept that our daughter was not going to be capable of these things and that she deserved an opportunity to express and try just like everybody else. And I just think Sameer is a myth buster, really, in so many ways, by being able to contribute to our viewers today with what is just such an abstract thought, like poetry, Rob, because poetry takes some high abstract ability, I think. It's already been 90 minutes. So usually I ask everyone, what thoughts would you like to, if there was one thought you wanted to leave with our viewers around this, what would it be? And Sameer, I know it might take a little time to put that forward, but I hope that you'll try, and we'll start with Erika and kind of go around.
I guess I'll kind of stem off what you just said. I think if I could leave one thing with all the parents or, like teachers or anyone out there, is believe in your students or children. It doesn't hurt to read them these things or teach them these things. You're not hurting them with that, believe in them, expose them to information, things that are out there. Start small, build that tolerance, small increments at a time. And just believe in them because they are capable of learning it.
Wonderful. Stephen.
Well, I think the most important thing to realize is that we must not judge people on their ability to use spoken word, to verbalize. We now know that there are many ways to communicate. And I know so many people who have been given up on as too severe, too something or other, measured IQs, either freezing temperature or room temperature. But then either by design or sometimes by mistake, perhaps this person starts tapping out words on a keyboard and somebody realizes, oh, this person knows how to communicate. So it's up to us to realize that the most important thing we can do, and probably the first thing we should do, is provide a reliable means of communication for autistic people.
Absolutely right. Marlo, you're next.
Yeah, I think that I don't know. I've learned so much from Sameer that I feel like I know a lot less about autism than I have ever known in my life. And that as we're maybe uncovering some of these things, I like the term, you know, the sleuth, that he may be the sleuth that's helping us. I think this idea that intelligence and autism are somehow separated, that, you know, we have all this intellectual disability in autism, or we have all this impairment, cognitive impairment in autism. And yet I think those of us who really work with these kids through a lifespan, through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases, we have yet to meet a really low IQ kid, truly. If you trust what the definition of IQ is not necessarily the ability to articulate, but the ability to think and reason and problem solve at a very high level. So I'd like to say that and it's sort of a horrifying thought, but I think it's possible that many of these non-vocal kids have much, much higher intellectual capabilities than we have ever possibly imagined. And that until we can give them competence or assume competence, that we're not going to get anything beyond that. I think it's like those years when we assumed that people who had cerebral palsy were all intellectually disabled. I think it's that same kind of thing. And I think over time, we're going to look back in this period of history and be appalled at our views on intelligence and autism. So I'd like to kind of throw that out there with this idea that we have to at least start by assuming competence.
Rob, would you like to?
I love those. I love what you said, Marlo. I just want to bring home one specific point that I think was brought out by Marlo, which I think is important. It's been in the back of my mind for a long time, that when you get overwhelmed by something, let's say the visual, it's kind of mutually exclusive to all the good stuff that you want. And the point that you were making, Marlo, that wait, I don't want to lose my personality. That's what kids have told me. You're changing my personality. Well, maybe, maybe there's some truth in that when kids are aware like that. And just today, I had a kid, I asked the parents over Zoom, what is she saying? What is he? And they kept on telling me the kid is saying, scripting a movie. He's scripting Mickey Mouse. He's not in the present. He just has all this stuff in his head. And what I told the parents today, and I think you're kind of bringing this out in me as well, if we could lower that volume of scripting, it'll allow this other good stuff to come in and real language to come in, which he has a little of. I want to reverse the roles. Instead of 90% script and 10% language, I want to reverse those roles. And I see that as being kind of mutually exclusive. I just wanted to bring that one point home.
Thanks, Rob. I wanted to let everybody know Sameer had a closing thought that not shockingly at all is rather profound. And it's important to remember. Many kids are like me. Do remember them. Believe. Thank you. Goodbye. There's 40% of this population that struggles to communicate at our convenience. And I think we should assume competence. I love your point, Marlo. I was trained as a massage therapist. One of the first things I was trained to understand is 80% of language is body language. It's not spoken. So I think there's a lot we assume based on verbal. And there's a lot more communication to be had, and there's many ways to get to it. And it really just comes back to, if there's one thing I've learned through this series, we have to open a space and we have to meet our fellow human beings on the spectrum where they are at. And we have to be willing to give and learn what they're trying to say and what is trying to be said, because I do believe they communicate. I just want to thank Sameer and Erika, Rob, Stephen, Marlo. Thank you for yet again an amazing panel. I think we have one more, Marlo. We have one more in the series of Approaches to Autism. If you haven't seen this series, I'm going to encourage you to go to the US Autism website. You can see and learn so much through the course of the many conferences we've given, and it's all to just help us all make that space. So thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next month.